Welcome to Joystick Heist. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating explainer that traces the bizarre, tragic, and honestly mind-boggling medical evolution of how U.S. presidents have met their end. We usually think of history through this grand lens of policy and politics, but today, we're going to look at it through the lens of mortality. From the absolute infancy of American healthcare all the way up to the cutting-edge medicine of the modern era, the stories of how our commanders-in-chief spent their final moments are just packed with unbelievable coincidences, massive medical blunders, and some pretty incredible resilience. So how exactly did raw cherries, contaminated tap water, and downright terrible medical malpractice shape U.S. history? Well, let's dive into it, because the historical reality of presidential mortality is honestly far stranger than any fiction you could ever dream up. We tend to put these figures on an indestructible pedestal, right? But looking at the historical record, their lives were abruptly altered and sometimes ended by things as incredibly mundane as a bowl of summer fruit or a glass of water from the wrong tap. By unpacking these records, we're going to uncover exactly how much medical science, dumb luck, and the creation of elite protective details completely rewrote the survivability of the most dangerous job in the world. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Early Bizarre Medical Mishaps. We kind of have to start our journey in what you might call the dark ages of American medicine, a time way before antibiotics or even germ theory. Take our very first president, George Washington. After riding his horse in some freezing, snowy weather, he developed epiglottitis. Basically, this is just an inflammation of that little flap at the base of your tongue. Now, while this is a super easy fix today, the esteemed medical professionals of 1799 had a completely different and unfortunately deadly approach to curing a sore throat. Instead of giving him medicine, his doctors went with a hugely popular technique at the time called bloodletting. They literally cut his arm to drain blood from his body, thinking it would somehow, purge the sickness. They ended up draining an estimated 80 ounces of blood from the nation's founding father. To put that into perspective, that is the fluid equivalent of 6 entire cans of Red Bull. Obviously, this massive loss of fluids didn't save him. It actually just dramatically sped up his demise. But here's the thing. Despite the horrific medical care he was getting, Washington was completely stoic until the very end. Before passing, he told his doctors he was dying hard, but he absolutely wasn't afraid to go. As he finally struggled to take his last breaths, he left us with these legendary, peaceful final words, "'Tis well." It perfectly reflects his total acceptance of his fate, just bowing out with incredible grace despite the brutal circumstances. Now, it's honestly wild how basic food and water safety, or the total lack thereof, abruptly ended 2 entire presidencies. William Henry Harrison notoriously gave this grueling 2-hour inauguration speech in the freezing rain, and for over a century, everyone just assumed he died of pneumonia. But modern research actually tells a totally different story. He likely died from typhoid fever or septic shock caused by contaminated drinking water right there at the White House, ending his presidency in a record-short 31 days. Then we have Zachary Taylor, who tried to beat the sweltering Washington, D.C. heat during a 4th of July celebration by eating a massive bowl of raw cherries and washing it down with several glasses of milk. Because food safety was practically non-existent back then, he contracted severe gastroenteritis and died just 3 days later. Since Taylor was the sitting president during an era of really intense pre-Civil War tension, rumors immediately spread like wildfire that his political enemies had intentionally poisoned those cherries. Forensic scientists actually exhumed his body in the 1990s to test this exact theory. But they found absolutely nothing fishy. It literally really was just bad cherries. Despite the agonizing stomach pain, Taylor went out with a remarkably clear conscience, stating, "I'm about to die. I expect the summons soon. I've tried to discharge my duties faithfully. I regret nothing." Moving right along to Section 2, the July 4th Curse. This brings us to what is arguably the most insane set of historical coincidences in American history, involving the actual birthday of the nation itself. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams started as revolutionary friends, became bitter political rivals, and then eventually reconciled as pen pals in their later years. But on July 4, 1826, which was exactly 50 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson died from a combination of ailments, including a kidney infection. Just hours later, John Adams died up in Massachusetts. And if that wasn't crazy enough, 5 years later in 1831, James Monroe became the 3rd founding father to check out on the exact same national holiday. The tragic irony of John Adams's famous last words is almost too poetic to be real. Picture this. As a sickly 90-year-old man dealing with heart failure, Adams lay in his bed, completely unaware that his lifelong frenemy had passed away just hours prior down in Virginia. His final whispered words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." And we almost had a July 4th quadfecta. James Madison, the brilliant father of the Constitution, was suffering from congestive heart failure. His doctors were desperately trying to pump him full of stimulants to keep him alive just long enough to hit July 4th. But Madison, ever the sharp wit, famously turned them down. When his niece noticed him fading, she asked what was wrong, and he just casually replied, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear. I always talk better lying down." He passed away on June 28th, just days shy of joining the infamous club. Which brings us to Section 3, Assassinations and Medical Malpractice. As we push further into history, the threats against our commanders-in-chief shifted from bad fruit to targeted violence, revealing some fatal holes in physical protection. Abraham Lincoln stands as one of the greatest leaders in American history, yet his life was cut short in broad daylight at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. This tragic assassination casually disrupted the entire trajectory of the country. But what's truly fascinating is that a man so known for his soaring rhetoric and incredible speeches didn't leave us with profound final words of wisdom. Instead, his last recorded words were incredibly mundane. Right before the trigger was pulled, his wife asked what people might think of them holding hands in public at the theater, and Lincoln just calmly reassured her, "She won't think anything about it." Now, Lincoln died almost instantly, right? But our 20th president, James Garfield, faced a way more agonizing fate. So the really crucial point here isn't just the assassin's bullet, but the absolute disaster of medical intervention that followed. Garfield was shot in the back, but the bullet totally missed all his vital organs. It was actually highly survivable. However, the doctor stepped in and aggressively probed the open wound with unsterilized, bare hands. In that chaotic process, they accidentally punctured his liver. They literally turned a non-fatal injury into a death sentence, causing these massive infections that slowly killed him over the next 80 torturous days. His heartbreaking final words, directed at a close friend he called Swaim, really highlight the sheer, unnecessary suffering caused by the medical malpractice he endured. He didn't die of a gunshot wound. He died of a 19th century medical system that hadn't yet figured out basic hygiene and germ theory. And this awful pattern continued with William McKinley, who was shot in the abdomen by an anarchist. Once again, doctors frantically performed this rudimentary game of operation, failing completely to locate the bullet inside his stomach. 8 days later, gangrene set in, and McKinley passed away. Now, here's why this matters today. Americans were officially fed up. The sheer incompetence and vulnerability surrounding the commander-in-chief became the ultimate catalyst that birthed the modern elite protective detail we know today. McKinley's tragic death directly forced the Secret Service to take full-time responsibility for protecting the president. And hey, it's a very good thing they did, because McKinley's vice president was none other than Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy was arguably the toughest president in American history. While running again as a third-party candidate in 1912, he was shot point-blank in the chest while stepping out of a hotel. But instead of rushing to the hospital, this absolute warrior got right back up and delivered an 84-minute campaign speech with the fresh bullet still bleeding inside his chest. I mean, no way, right? He just shrugged it off, ultimately surviving the attempt and passing away peacefully from a blood clot years later at the age of 60. Let's move on to Section 4, the era of modern longevity. Thanks directly to that Secret Service protection we just talked about, combined with some truly exponential leaps in medical science, the story of presidential deaths completely transforms. When we look at the data side by side, the average lifespan of 18th and 19th century presidents hovered around 70 years old. But as we transition into the 20th century, that average jumps up to 78 years old. That's nearly an entire decade of life added, entirely due to advances in how we protect and medically treat our leaders. You really see this longevity explode when we look at our recent history. Despite shouldering the immense, unprecedented stress of the modern presidency, these leaders have absolutely shattered historical longevity records. Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan both lived to be 93, George H.W. Bush lived to 94, and Jimmy Carter remarkably reached a full 100 years old, setting an all-time record. It just proves that thanks to modern science, the most dangerous job in the world is vastly safer than it has ever been. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 5, Presidential Deaths by Numbers. Before we close this out, stepping back and just looking at the hard numbers gives us a really crystal clear picture. Exactly 8 U.S. presidents never made it out of office alive. And what is incredibly striking here is how perfectly balanced this tragic statistic is. It's split exactly down the middle. 4 died from natural biological failures and illnesses, and 4 were tragically taken from us by targeted assassinations. And finally, the number 100. As we just mentioned, that represents Jimmy Carter, cementing him as the oldest president at the time of death. This incredible milestone sits in a very stark, sobering contrast to John F. Kennedy, who was tragically the youngest president ever killed in office, struck down in Dallas at just 46 years old. It perfectly encapsulates the extreme spectrum of presidential fates. From the archaic horrors of 18th century bloodletting to the medical marvels that are creating 21st century centenarians, the evolution of how our presidents leave this world is just a wild reflection of American history itself. So, I gotta ask, which bizarre presidential fate surprised you the most? Think about that for a second. Thank you so much for joining this explainer today. If you enjoyed this structured journey through the strange and fascinating side of history, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Joystick Heist for more incredible, data-driven content. We'll catch you in the next one.